The snow fell quietly over the Yorkshire countryside, blanketing the hedgerows and rooftops in a muted white. I stood at the old gate of my childhood home, fingers numb inside my gloves, one hand gripping the handle of a pet carrier. Inside it, nestled against a soft fleece blanket, was a Persian cat with a silky grey coat and golden eyes, Mum's birthday gift. Her 60th. I'd spent weeks looking for the right one. Mum adored cats. She always said they were the only creatures who gave affection without expectation. I'd chosen this one, whom I'd already named Florence, because she reminded me of a little cat ornament Mum had kept by the kitchen window. As I pushed open the garden gate, the wind howled faintly behind me, catching the scarf around my neck. I hadn't been home in months. Things had grown distant. Unspoken. Yet today felt different. I wanted Mum to feel special. She deserved that. Dad opened the door before I could knock. His eyes glanced from me to the carrier in my hand. No greeting. No warmth. "What's that?" he asked sharply. I hesitated. "It's for Mum. For her birthday." He stepped aside without a word, and I entered. The warmth inside didn't match the cold in his stare. The house looked the same. Old wallpaper, the faded rug, the ticking clock. Everything untouched, as though time had slowed here. Mum appeared at the kitchen doorway, apron on, wiping her hands on a tea towel. When she saw the carrier, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Oh, Ellie, is that?" "Her name's Florence," I said with a small smile. "She's yours." Mum crouched beside the carrier and opened it gently. Florence stepped out cautiously, then curled against Mum's legs like she belonged. Mum looked up at me, tears forming. "She's beautiful." But before either of us could say more, Dad stepped forward. "Get that thing out of the house." Silence. Mum's hand froze on Florence's back. "Excuse me," I said quietly. "You heard me. I don't want it in here. Bloody fur all over the furniture. It's a waste." Mum didn't say a word. She didn't plead or argue. She simply picked up Florence again, kissed her head softly, and gently placed her back inside the carrier. Her hands trembled. I looked between them, my heart pounding. But Mum only smiled faintly at me, as if to say it was all right. I'll take her upstairs for now," she said softly, disappearing up the stairs with the carrier. Dad returned to his chair, picking up the newspaper like nothing had happened. The clock ticked. Outside, the snow kept falling. Days passed, and the snow outside began to melt into the dull grays of early spring. Yet inside the house, the cold lingered, not from the weather but from a silence heavier than any frost. Mum barely spoke. She went about her daily chores as usual, preparing meals, tidying the rooms, but there was a distance now, a quiet retreat that filled every corner of the house. I tried to talk to her. Asked if she wanted help with anything or if she'd like to visit the vet with Florence. She smiled politely but her eyes seemed far away, like she was somewhere else entirely. Dad, on the other hand, carried on as though nothing had changed. He read his paper, muttered about work, and ignored the glances Mum sent his way. I noticed the sharpness in his tone whenever Florence's name came up. He never called her it again, but his dislike was clear. One evening, I found Mum in the kitchen, staring blankly at the stove. She had prepared the usual dinner, meat and vegetables, but the food was untouched on the plates. "Are you all right?" I asked gently. She looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I'm fine, Ellie. Just tired." But the truth hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. That night, I heard voices downstairs. Dad was asking questions in a cold, sharp tone. Mum's answers were quiet, resigned. I wanted to intervene, to protect her, but I stayed silent, unsure what to do. The next morning, the house felt emptier. The days stretched on, one blending into the next, with the same dull routine playing out under the cold Yorkshire skies. I stayed as much as I could, though the tension in the house was like a thick fog that no one dared to break. Florence, the little Persian cat, had found a quiet corner upstairs where she would sit silently, watching the world through a dusty windowpane, as if she too understood the unspoken grief that had settled in. Mum's smiles became rarer, her eyes duller. She moved with a weariness I'd never seen before. There was a stillness about her that went deeper than tiredness. It was as though something inside had quietly cracked, a fracture no one else could see but me. One afternoon, I caught her in the garden, staring at a withered rose bush. The same bush she had tended for years, the one Dad had once complimented her on when they first moved in. Now, it drooped lifeless, much like the warmth that had once filled this home. "Why don't you prune it?" I asked gently. She didn't look at me, just sighed. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "It feels like everything I care for is dying." I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stayed silent, letting her have her moment. Back inside, the dinner table was a quiet battleground. Dad continued to sit rigidly, his face set in a permanent scowl. When Mum served the meal, he barely touched it, complaining it was too cold or not seasoned right. Mum accepted the criticisms without reply, lowering her gaze. One night, I overheard Dad muttering in the kitchen. "She's soft. Always has been. This house needs order, not pity." Mum was quiet in response, but I could tell the words cut deep. That weekend, Mum asked me if I could take Florence out for a walk in the garden. It was the first time she'd said anything to me beyond the usual pleasantries. I agreed, noticing a faint flicker of hope in her eyes. We sat on the garden bench, Florence curled in my lap, and for a brief moment, the cold felt a little less biting. But as the sun dipped behind the hills, the silence returned. Mum's shoulders sagged, and she whispered something I almost didn't hear. "I don't think I can do this anymore." The words Mum had whispered haunted me long after that evening. I tried to hold on to a hope that things might change, but the house seemed to grow colder by the day. The distance between Mum and Dad was no longer just silent tension, it had become a chasm impossible to cross. One morning, I woke early to find Mum sitting by the window, wrapped in a worn shawl, staring blankly at the garden where the frost still clung stubbornly to the branches. Florence lay curled on the windowsill, her breathing soft and steady. Mum's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, as if holding onto some invisible thread. I sat beside her quietly. "Would you like to talk?" She shook her head slowly. "It's not the talking, Ellie. It's the listening. He doesn't listen anymore." I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to admit. Dad's silence was often colder than any argument. His refusal to meet her halfway was a wall Mum could no longer climb. Days later, the breaking point came without warning. Dad arrived home late, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Mum was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as usual. She placed the plates on the table, her hands trembling slightly. Dad barely glanced at the food before reaching for a box sitting on the sideboard. It was the gift I had brought for Mum's birthday, the pet carrier. With a harsh scoff, Dad lifted it and carried it outside. I followed silently, my heart pounding as he dumped the carrier on the porch steps. "Get rid of it," he snapped. "I won't have that cat bringing filth into this house." Mum's face went pale. She stood frozen in place, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned and walked back inside, her shoulders hunched, carrying the weight of years of silent pain. That night, Mum didn't cook. She barely ate. She sat in her chair, staring into the flickering flame of the fireplace as if trying to burn away the sorrow. I stayed up, watching her, wondering how long she could keep going like this. The days that followed were heavy with silence and sadness. Mum moved through the house like a shadow, present but distant, her spirit dimmed beneath the weight of the unspoken grief. The cat, Florence, stayed curled in her corner, a small symbol of the tenderness Mum desperately needed but could no longer reach for. I tried to bridge the growing divide between my parents. I offered to help more around the house, to spend time with Mum, to distract her with small joys. But the truth was, no distraction could mask the truth that Mum was unraveling inside. One chilly afternoon, I found Mum sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the letter she had been writing for days. The paper was crumpled at the edges, as though the words were as hard to hold as the feelings they contained. "Ellie," she said softly when she saw me. "I think it's time. Time for me to leave." My heart clenched painfully. "Leave? But where would you go?" She looked away, eyes shining with tears. "I can't stay here anymore. Not like this." I wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but I understood. Sometimes, the only way to heal was to walk away. That evening, Mum packed a small bag. She left a note on the kitchen table addressed to Dad, explaining that she needed time to find herself again. She didn't want to fight, didn't want anger or blame. Just space and peace. As she stepped out into the cold night, Florence cradled safely in her arms, I felt a mixture of sorrow and hope. Sorrow for the family that was breaking, hope that this might be the first step toward something better. The house was empty when Mum left. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than ever, marking the start of a new chapter none of us had asked for. After Mum left, the house felt emptier than ever. The rooms, once filled with the warmth of family laughter and love, now echoed with silence. Dad's presence was like a shadow, always there but cold and distant. The ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece seemed to mock the stillness. I stayed as much as I could, trying to hold the fragments of our family together. Florence, now fully accepted by all of us, was the only small spark of life in the house. She roamed freely, curling up in Mum's favorite armchair, as if claiming a piece of her presence. Dad barely spoke, and when he did, his words were sharp and hollow. He cooked less and less, waiting each evening for the meals Mum used to prepare. But this time, the food stayed untouched, growing cold under the harsh kitchen lights. One evening, I found Dad sitting alone at the kitchen table, his face weary and worn. The silence between us stretched like a vast chasm. "I miss her," he said quietly, his voice cracking. For once, the cold wall around him seemed to crumble. "We all do," I replied softly. That night, I realized that the house wasn't just a building, it was a collection of memories, pain, and hope. It was broken, but not beyond repair. As winter deepened, so did the distance between us. But beneath the frost, a quiet longing for healing lingered, waiting for a chance to thaw. Winter was fading when a letter arrived one cold morning. The envelope was plain, unassuming, but the handwriting was unmistakably Mum's. My heart pounded as I broke the seal and unfolded the page inside. The letter was not filled with anger or blame, but with words of reflection and hope. Mum spoke of her love for us all, her sadness over the years lost in silence, and her wish for healing and understanding. She wrote that she had found a small cottage in the countryside, somewhere peaceful where she could begin again, slowly and quietly. She asked Dad and me to take care of each other, and above all, to remember the love that had once held us together. Dad read the letter aloud that evening. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if the words were fragile treasures. For the first time in many months, the house felt less cold, as if Mum's words had brought a gentle warmth back into the walls. We did not know what the future held, but that letter was a beginning, a fragile thread connecting us back to hope and to each other. Spring had just started to breathe new life into the garden when Mum returned. Not to the house that felt cold and empty, but to a new beginning. She arrived with Florence trotting happily beside her, her eyes brighter and full of quiet strength. Dad met her at the door. The years of silence between them seemed to melt away in that moment. There was no grand speech, no tears or arguments, just a simple, heartfelt embrace that spoke volumes. They spoke softly in the kitchen, the place where so many memories had been made and broken. Slowly, conversations replaced silence, and laughter began to find its way back into the rooms. I watched them from the stairs, a sense of hope filling my chest. Our family was far from perfect, but the cracks were healing, filled with patience and love. That birthday, the cat was no longer just a gift, it was a symbol of new beginnings. Of forgiveness, resilience, and the quiet power of hope. We had been broken, but we were not lost. Together, we were finding our way home.